9. The Savior Returns. Written by Celestial Rainbow. Narrated by AJ the Elementalgod. Chapter 4. Return to the Dead Battlefield. 9 scouted the unfamiliar area for nearly 8 hours before he found a safe place where he could keep 2's fragile body, protected from the harsh elements. It was a simple countryside house with buckling wood and nearly collapsed roof. However, it would do as a shelter for 9 and a safe place where he could keep his friends until they were ready to return. Once he had 2 safe, kept away from the outside world, 9 ran into the wastelands to find the others. He didn't rest at all. The mission at hand was far too important. 9 knew all the stupid mistakes had boiled down to this task he had been given. 9 began to head back to where he had came from, the city. He walked for miles, not stopping once. He used landmarks that were familiar to him to lead him back into the city, to the place where he knew where he needed to start. Retracing his steps, he was brought to the shell of what used to be the large building. However, most of it was burned away. It lay in the midst of an oil field. The droning of the steel-working oil pumps gave him a reassurance of familiarity. 9 ventured about, looking inside the shell of the ash-covered rubble. He looked around as he carefully stepped through the wreckage. Upon getting a closer look, 9 instantly recognized this building as the destroyed factory of the fabrication machine had once resided in. It had been connected to the factory, and they tried to kill it, and in the process destroyed the factory. It had somehow survived the fire and the detonation, and then came after him. He couldn't bear to think what had happened afterwards. 9's heart fell, and he felt very uncomfortable being in this place. But he knew he must continue. 9 knew that somewhere hidden in this destruction was 8, the guardian he was too late to save. He looked all around, trying not to think of what had happened in the factory. All of those events played in his mind like a video 4 was showing him. He remembered watching 7 being handed off to the machine, running for life down a tunnel as an army of spider beasts scuttled after him, and 7. He inserted the talisman into the fabrication machine, awaking it. 9 pushed these memories back as far as he could in his mind. He couldn't think about the terrible past he had focused on, the present, and what he had to do. Crawling slowly through the rubble so it wouldn't cave in on him, 9 looked all around 8's body. As he searched, the young ragdoll became discouraged and frightened. What if he didn't survive the massive explosion and later collapsed from the factory? What if he had disintegrated into mere ash, never to be found? Then, much to his relief, 9 came across 8. He was lying underneath a slab of concrete. Because he had been buried underneath the rubble, his body had miraculously survived the enormous blast. A piece of the ceiling or wall must have collapsed on top of him. 9 pushed the ruins off of him, examining his body. His left arm was burned slightly, but luckily, that was it. 9 had once watched 5 and 7. He could do the same with 8. He heaved 8's enormous body out of the wreckage. Panting, 8 was huge and heavy, but 9 was just strong enough to heave him away from the destruction. He crawled back out of the rubble, dragging the bodyguard with him. Finally, they were on level ground. 9 set 8 down with a huff, already worn out. He couldn't possibly drag 8 all the way to the house. He looked around him, trying to figure out some sort of plan. 9 suddenly spotted a thin rope laying around the splintered piece of wood. Getting to his feet, 9 walked over to the plank and seized the rope. He then found a thin, curved sheet of metal. Using an old rusted nail, 9 managed to cut 2 holes into the corners of the sheet. He tied a strong knot to each hole with the rope. After doing this, 9 heaved 8's body into his arms and then gently set him onto the metal sheet. Taking the 2 ends of the rope and sliding them over his shoulders, 9 proceeded to drag 8 home. He carefully maneuvered the rubble under until he and 8 were nearly out of the remains of the factory. Suddenly, 9 spotted an oddly familiar bar of metal sticking out of the debris nearby. He blinked and tilted his head curiously. He set 8 down and ran over to it, reaching down and removed the metal debris off the bar. It was the remains of his light staff. He blinked. In slight surprise, the only thing missing from it was the glass shard. Glass shards stuck out from the base. The holder was intact, a bit bent on one side. 9 held onto the staff tightly, looking at the ground. Reaching beside him, he picked up the battery, fallen out of the staff when he used it to bait the seamstress and kill it. He unzipped his chest and placed the battery inside of it himself, taking the staff with him. He returned to 8 and slugged the rope over his shoulders. The old house looked like a human had once owned it, and had hastily moved to escape the war and left the house of his or her possessions behind. There were old and tattered books, dusty and broken furniture dotted nearly every corner, rugs that were once soft covered from the worn floorboards. The house wasn't very large, but 9 felt very, very alone and very small, left to himself and his thoughts. He couldn't help but think of the deadly green lights, glowing red eyes, and of course, the only family he had left, and the words that she had last said to him. 9 laid 8 to rest next to 2, and then turned immediately, going to continue his search. For a moment, he scoured around the house, trying to find some sort of sack or something he could use to carry around with him. As he ventured into the wastelands, he discovered a flat board with 4 wooden wheels attached to it. It appeared to be a toy cart that was used to belong to a child. Smiling slightly, 9 was inspired by his memory of 2's roller skate cart he had used in the emptiness. He set out once more, walking through the house, the rope slung over his shoulder. By the front door, he lay a small desk lamp, its hood bent and cracked. Inside there lay a grim-covered small light bulb. 9 picked up the staff, removing the splintered pieces of the glass. He unscrewed the light bulb from the lamp, just as he once watched 5 do. He had a sudden memory strike him. He and his friend had made a light staff together before venturing into the factory to save 2. 9 held the light bulb in his hands, staring down at it, and it thought back to his memory, one of the few good ones he had in the first few days of life. Dropping the battery in the holder, 9 fitted the bulb into the socket and screwed it in. It immediately lit up, making him blink. A soft yellow light filled the space around him, and he gave a faint smile, which disappeared almost as fast as it had appeared on his face.
2 would be impressed.
We'll find him. 9's fist tightened around the staff as he bent his head, taking a deep breath. Raising his head with the most determination he could muster, he began to venture out into the wastelands once more. 9 blinked as he looked upon the dead fabrication machine, laying desolately and lifelessly in the dust. He could only stare at it, the feelings within him waging a war he couldn't explain. This monster before him had caused him and his friends so much pain. He had torn his coven apart. 9 walked slowly around it, images and memories flashing through his mind. He remembered standing his ground as the force of the talisman's power nearly knocked him backwards. He remembered trying to run away out of the underneath and the toppling machine. And finally, to do so, he remembered the sudden blackness overcome him, and waking up to see her beautiful face. He closed his eyes, thinking of Seven was too painful. I understood why she was angry with him. He wanted to lead them on some other trek when the twins were already exhausted. She was the twins' older sister. There was no question about it. It meant that she protected them, no matter what or who got in her way. He would have never yelled at that. He should have never yelled at her. However, the words she had spoken ripped his heart to shreds, and each time he thought of them, it hurt. It hurt more than he could imagine. She was his closest friend, but at this moment in time, he didn't know if he was ever going to see her again. Opening his eyes, he approached the machine slowly, thinking of how this soulless murderer had taken so many of his friends away from him. Even in death, the horrific monster still looked terrifying and foreboding. Nine squeezed himself underneath its frame, looking all over for who had stopped his sacrifice, given his own life instead. 1. Nine walked around underneath the hollow frame and lifted a large gear. He paused only for a second and touched the single cable lying on the ground, fallen from the towering machine above. He remembered Seven smiling widely at him in relief as he regained his consciousness, and how she had embraced him tightly. He looked away, brow furrowing as he reprimanded himself. Nine couldn't think about Seven right now. There were more important matters to deal with. He threw the gear to his side of him, wincing as his weak shoulder gave a small shot of pain. Nine immediately clutched it, sighing sadly, ignoring the dull throbbing in his shoulder. He looked sadly at one's crumpled figure, laying on the ground before him. He walked to one and kneeled beside him, turning him gently to lie on his back. One stared up at him lifelessly, broken. His eyes were wide and blank, and his mouth agape. Nine picked up his limp left arm as he looked over the dead elder and examined his crippled hand. He winced, knowing that he would have to somehow heal his hand. He remembered a thin sheet of metal he'd dragged 8 home with. He carefully picked up the crumpled old man, cradling him in his arms. Nine looked down at the man who had hated him with sadness, wondering how one would react when he was brought back to his body. He then navigated them both out from underneath the machine, placing one gently in the cart. He turned and began his trek back. Nine soon lost track of time, as the days passed, blurring together as he went to nearly every place he had been in his short life. He couldn't look at the 3 bodies, lying side by side for a while. Every time he did, he wanted to sink to his knees and cry until he was exhausted, and his voice box was broken. However, he managed to stay strong and decided to take a single day to find the things they had once belonged to them. He found 8's weapons, covered in ash from the burned-down Cartridal. Nearby, he managed to find one's staff and the gem that had belonged to his cape, ripping a piece of red fabric from what looked like a curtain. Nine attached the gemstone to it and gave a small chuckle. He didn't owe one a cape anymore. Nine walked and walked, picking up small things that could be useful and help him heal his friends. He then found, with a pang of regret and shame, Seven's skullnet, her spear, and her shield. He put everything into the cart except her shield. He kept it, held to his chest. Thinking of the warrior, he made a promise to return to them soon, to tell her how sorry he was, and he was never leaving her again, if he could find her again. He didn't have a good reason for collecting all of their old possessions. The weapons were no longer needed. They were going to live in a safe and quiet world. but he wanted it to be like before, like nothing bad had ever happened, like he'd never come to the Coven in the first place. Collecting all these things helped him reassure himself that everything would be okay. He then scoured the lands for a silver candle holder and a pair of eyeglasses. He delicately constructed a new top hat for two, even managed to get half of the spectacles to swing in and out. It wasn't as nice as Two's old one, but at least he would have something. Nine just hoped that he would be able to give it to him soon. Nine was walking out of the vast emptiness in the dead of night. Every star in the sky was completely hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. Wind blew desolately through the silent city. He was traveling through the barren outskirts of the city, where nothing existed but vast dry fields of rock and dirt. He looked around, trying to spot familiar landmarks through the darkness of the night. Suddenly, he came across an old record player, lying against some splintering wooden boards. Spiked wire fences surround it, and a tall radio tower has made shadowed silhouettes against the sky. Nine could only stare at the record player. He walked up to it very slowly, heart thudding against his chest. Lifting a hand, and he ran his finger across the crank, slowly trailing them along the side. Long indents appeared in the layers of dust, reminding him just how long it had been. Nine stared at it for a moment, remembering very clearly what had happened besides this record player. His hands curled into fists. Nine bent forward and rested his forehead against the side of the record player for a moment. He felt the sadness tearing at his heart as he remembered who he'd lost here. Taking a deep breath, he looked up at the dry oil barrens in front of him. Five's body was laying, limp and lifeless, before him. His head was turned away from Nine. His fingers sprawled out on the ground. Nine walked towards Five slowly, crouching beside him, reaching forward with a shaking hand. He took Five's cold shoulder, turning him to his face. He forced himself not to recoil when he saw Five's destroyed eye patch, and the hole where his other eye had once been. Nine sank to his knees, feeling the pain overwhelm him. It was nearly too much. Seeing the man who had been his best friend lying lifelessly in the dirt and knowing that it was his fault, he nearly couldn't bear it. Bending down, Nine gently slid his arms underneath Five. He wrapped his arms around the healer's cold form and brought him to his lap, rocking him gently. Nine couldn't hold the soft, straggled sob within him as he dropped his forehead to touch his friend's. I miss you, Five, he whispered softly, closing his eyes and hugging Five close. A war of emotions clashed within him. He could only sit there, overcome with sorrow. His shoulders shook as he wept quietly. The sharp whistling of the wind caught his attention. Nine looked up to the sky, seeing something sparkling weakly in a break in the clouds. It was a little star, twinkling against the dark backdrop of the night. The star watched over the lonely world, keeping a constant, silent vigil. Nine had watched this very same star every night since the machine had been killed. Most often, Seven had been by his side, and in that moment, he wondered if she was looking at that same star and missing him, just as he missed her. Suddenly, the screeching of the wind picked up. Nine immediately rushed to his feet. A monstrous sandstorm was swallowing the remains of the factory, racing for him. Gathering Five to his arms, he turned back to the storm, feeling like he was punched in the back. Nine felt his head down low, and the sandstorm overcame him, engulfing the world in a mass swirling debris. Squinting and keeping Five close to protect him, Nine began to walk back to his dwelling. He bent down for a moment, picking up Five's utility bag, which was lying next to the record player. Dust that was covered it and swept off the storm. Slightly over his shoulder, Nine determinedly strode away from the desolate place. Seven was kneeling next to the twins and covered the slumbering Stitchpunks with a soft, ragged cloth while the wind whistled past them. They had taken refuge underneath an ancient car for the night. They had been wandering almost aimlessly for the past few days. Seven was determined to find a comfortable home for her little brothers. In this moment of quiet, she felt so alone. Even with the two small Stitchpunks, she had adapted into the solitude and the silence when she was by herself in the emptiness, hunting the beasts, but she'd gotten so used to having Nine with her, she felt almost empty without him besides her. Suddenly, she heard the wind pick up strongly and peered out from where she was hiding. Stepping out from underneath the automobile, Seven watched in the edge of the path where she had a clear view of the land around her. Way off in the distance, there was a thunderous sandstorm racing across the countryside. However, it wasn't headed for them, so she wasn't terribly bothered. Leaning against a piece of car door buried in the earth, Seven observed the quiet night. Glancing up into the sky, she spotted a familiar twinkle, a little star shining through the clouds. Every night she and Nine gazed at that star before they went to sleep. It was those little moments she cherished, happy memories she could hold on to when most of hers was made with war and death. Seven sighed, bending her head. Ever since that awful day, she deeply regretted every word she had said to Nine. The image of his heartbroken expression bothered her, appearing every time she closed her eyes. At that moment, she caught herself remembering when he'd nearly been crushed to death by the machine, when she'd nearly lost him. She felt so lost, almost like she did now. There was a feeling very new to her. She was a dauntless warrior that never let fear take over. She always kept her head because the others needed her strength, needed her to defend them. But now? She had so many questions. Where was he now? Was he all right? Would she ever see him again? Was he right about everything? Looking up again, Seven remembered the last time she said that he was wrong, when he'd managed to save their friends' souls and kill the fabrication machine. Staring into the darkness, Seven made her decision. Nine could be right, or he could be very well wrong. She still didn't think he was going to be able to bring them back, but he was still her friend. Perhaps there was a small chance he could be right about everything. Even if he wasn't, he was all she and the twins had left. They were still a family. As soon as the sun rose tomorrow, she was going to find him. The next day, Nine stood looking down into the mist of a dangerously deep ravine. A heavy 50-foot coil rope was slung over his shoulder. He came up a mass of twisted, warped metal and splintering wood. He knew that these were the remains of the bridge he and the others connected one side of the chasm to the other, but the machine had destroyed it, taking 6 with it in the process. He made a noose with one of his hands in the rope, and then wound it around the piece of metal sticking out from the ground, tugging onto it harshly. He made sure the knot wouldn't undo and sent him plummeting into the darkness below. There was absolutely no hesitation in his actions. Nine tied the other end around his waist and clutched it tightly. Taking a deep breath of eerie morning air, he began the slow but sure descent into the deep ravine. The weak sunlight soon disappeared as he entered the bank of forever mists that hovered over the ravine. It was becoming hard to see as the darkness seemed to swallow him. He kept it close to the wall. His movements became slow and careful. It was tedious, slow work. He would loosen his grip, slide down a little, and then find the foothold and stop for a moment. This action was repeated countless times, and the silence left Nine to his thoughts. He found himself wondering where the others were, if they were somewhere safe, and if they wondered where he was as well. Climbing down the vast ravine, Nine had never felt so small than he did in those moments. He felt like he was the last living being and he was going to be left in the world by himself for the rest of time. He wanted desperately to find Seven and the twins and tell them he was never going to leave them again. However, he couldn't abandon his mission now, so he kept heading down deeper and deeper into the canyon, feeling as if he was never going to reach the bottom. It felt like hours before his feet finally touched level ground. Standing, Nine untied his waist and looked around. It was very dark. Mist covered the areas around him, and he couldn't see the other side, but he could just make out a wide, shallow river. Looking around, Nine spotted the barren hint of white against the murky darkness. He walked towards it and quickly realized that the black and white banded body he was searching for. He was crumbly, laying, broken, in a small grove of rocks. Water calmly splashed against his delicate fingers. Nine crossed the river and went to the crumpled figure of Six. Nine felt his hands around Six's body and trying to see how badly he was broken inside. Much to his surprise and relief, he didn't feel anything out of place or damage. His right shoulder, however, seemed dislocated, a small tear ripping through his striped skin. Nine brushed his fingers over the torn fabric. Sighing, he picked Six's limp, lifeless body up carefully from the rocks. Seeing that in death, he looked so peaceful. Nine walked back to the rope and tied back around his waist, letting Six rest over his shoulder. Even slower than the descent, Nine climbed. He didn't want to damage Six any further. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he blinked and the sunlight blinded him. His arms ached terribly, but he was nearly there. He could see the edge of the chasm just a few feet away. There was suddenly a slight snapping noise from above. Nine looked up sharply with a gasp. Where the rope was slung over the rock, it was beginning to fray, each fiber straining against his weight, and the razor clipped. Nine gasped, horrified. He tried to climb as fast as he could, trying to squeeze in the 5-minute climb into mere seconds. He was nearly there, just a few more inches. Nine's efforts were futile. As the last strand within the rope snapped, with a shout, Nine fell backwards back into the darkness. Six flew from his shoulder as the edge of the cliff raced away from him. His chest constricted, his head filled with a shrieking wind. There was another shout, a familiar voice. He was already dead? A cry slipped out of him and his body stopped short with his shoulder colliding with the face of the ravine. Quickly, reaching out with his free hand, his mind whirled and caught Six by his wrist. Nine brought him to his side, holding him closely before he lost him once more. Panting desperately, his heart racing, Nine struggled to regain his bearings. He found he was still clutching the rope, his body swinging perilously over the darkness of the chasm. Looking up, he saw a familiar face staring down at him in fright, hands clutching the end of the snapping rope. "Seven?" Nine cried in relief. A smile stretched across his face. Her eyes were wide in fright, but it appeared she sighed, and her features relaxed. He didn't know if she still hated him, but he was relieved to see her nonetheless. Seven tightened the grip of the rope, heaving, and then with the twins' help, the three were able to get Nine up into the solid ground. He lifted Six to the twins, who took him in their arms gently. Seven held Nine, climbing over the edge of the cliff, grasping his shoulders, and pulled him up to him. Now on solid ground, his knees and shaking arms gave out beneath him. He laid down, the world around him spinning. He closed his eyes, trying to catch his breath, stave off the panic from nearly falling to his death. Feeling a familiar hand clutching his shoulder, he sat up shakingly and turned to look at Seven. and was sitting on his knees beside him, staring at him anxiously. 9 almost couldn't believe she was here, and he couldn't stop the words from flowing forth. "I should have never left. I'm sorry for what I said. You were right, I was being stupid. I should have listened to you." Both Stitch Punks tried to apologize at the same time. They blinked, then awkwardly averted their eyes. 7 gave a small cough when 9 rubbed his left arm slyly. After a moment of silence, the male turned back to her. "Come on. I've got a shelter for us. I found them," he said as he took 7 to his elbow and helped him stand. The twins followed him. Their eyes flickered from the savior of the warriors' faces, wondering if they still didn't forgive each other and they were going to fight again. "All of them?" 7 breathed in astonishment as he nodded once solemnly. She blinked in surprise as he bent down before the twins and scooped 6 into his arms, cradling the dead artist to his chest, and so he led the 3 others to the shelter, leaving the forever mist behind them. End of Chapter 4.